Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream for the Shabbat podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. John Dominic Crossan, and today I'm going to be discussing his book titled The First Christmas, What the Gospels Really Teach About Jesus' Birth. That's the book we'll be talking about today. So welcome back to the History Valley podcast, Dr. Crossan.
It's always welcome. Always great to be welcomed back by you, Jacob.
It's always great to have you here. So can you tell us, based on the data that we do have, and based on what Matthew and Luke and the early Christians tell us about the birth of Jesus and what their views about when he was born and stuff, what do we know about them, what they say about Jesus that tells us about the origins of Christmas?
Well, they tell us a lot about Jesus, none of which is history. Let me put that up front. Of course, they know the name of Jesus, and of course, they know Mary and Joseph, and of course, they know Bethlehem and Nazareth and Egypt and Herod and the whole bunch. But let me begin with the most important word to get out here. The word is parable. Now, we know the Good Samaritan parable. Okay, Jerusalem existed, Jericho existed, the road went down. They're quite right, from Jerusalem to Jericho, 1,000 feet. Donkeys existed, inns existed, villains existed, the robbers existed, people got beaten up, denarii existed. All of the paraphernalia existed, but it's a fiction, with a bite. It's not told as gossip, like Jesus said. You hear the one about the Samaritan. It's a very serious fiction. It's a go and do likewise. And it doesn't mean cruise up and down the Jerusalem road disguised as a Samaritan till you find a beat up Jew. It says, go and do likewise, and ask you to think about it. That's a parable. And it doesn't make any difference whether we like them or not. Jesus used them. All right. When I'm talking about Matthew 1 and 2 and Luke 1 and 2, I recognize that is to honor the authorial intention. I recognize two different, that's why they're different, of course, parables. They're made up in plain language. Of course, the paraphernalia is there. Of course, Jesus did get born. Generally speaking, it's the best way to come into this earth, unless you're quarried or something. But they're not interested, whether we like it or not, in telling us about the factual, biographical data on the birth of Jesus. They have another intention. And if you want to be an evangelical and respect the gospel, you have to ask first, what is that intention? Then you can get to, what do they tell us? Why do they tell us? What does it mean? And everything else. So let me get the word parable up front then, Jacob, to begin with.
Does anything that Matthew and Luke tell us about the circumstances of Jesus' birth and where he was born, is any of that historical at all in the slightest, or is all of it mythologization of Jesus' birth?
Yeah, and I remember I did not use the word myth. I used the word parable, because myth, as I use the word, is about people that don't exist, like gods and goddesses, and say in the Iliad, the gods and goddesses who intervene in the Trojan War. Myth is a proper word for such beings. When you're talking about a human being, you're talking about Jesus and Mary and Joseph and Herod and all the rest of them. I use the term parable when something is made up about them. So let me give an example. Focus on Matthew. Anyone reading Matthew in the first century, or hearing Matthew in the first century, or anyone today, should immediately hear, wait a minute, there's a cruel ruler here who is trying to kill the predestined child, and in order to do it, he kills all the male children at the time of his birth. Wow, I've heard that story before. In fact, it sounds awfully much like plagiarism from the book of Exodus. So this guy, Herod the Great, he's kind of like a new Pharaoh. Wow. And Israel under this new Pharaoh It's weird because Jesus has to flee from Israel into Egypt. He's going in the wrong direction. You're supposed to come from Egypt into Israel. So Israel under Roman Herod is the new Egypt of bondage. Wow, that's dynamite. That's the sort of thing can get you crucified. So, for example, when you're reading Matthew, you find that the Magi come and ask about the king of the Jews. And they ask it to Herod, who's the Rome appointed king of the Jews. Not very smart, by the way, not very wise for wise men. And the next time you're going to see that term in Matthew's gospel is on the cross. Now, everything there, I think, is crystal clear. Matthew is doing what Matthew wants to do. Get ready for this gospel, people, because it's about the new Moses, and I'm going to take them up on the new Mount Sinai, what we call chapter 5, Sermon on the Mount, to give a new law. And you know what almost happened to Moses as a kid will almost happen to this child too. And that's Matthew. And if we don't like it, too bad, because it is Matthew. Oh, sorry, I should.
Matthew.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
I should add. No, it doesn't tell us where he was born. Matthew and Luke, just for example, if I could jump ahead a bit, both know he's Jesus of Nazareth. So each of them, in their own way, it has a problem. Well, if he's Jesus of Nazareth, how do we get him born in Bethlehem? Matthew's solution is to presume, he presumes it, that he was always living there, that Mary and Joseph were living in Bethlehem. When Jesus was born, he was born in the family home in Bethlehem, as it were. And then when he comes back from Egypt, wow, he's not going to go there under Archelos. So off he goes to Nazareth. We got him to Nazareth. On the other hand, of course, the most famous or infamous story is Luke, who has him travel from his home in Nazareth to Bethlehem to be registered, as it were, for taxation. Each of them has to get him to Bethlehem because he is to be the son of David. And the coded word is born in Bethlehem equals son of David. As you and I might say, if we were talking about an American president, we might say, born in a log cabin. And we would know immediately that means like Lincoln. It wouldn't tell us any information about the place that president was born, but it would make a claim like unto Lincoln. So what we have to do is ask ourselves, I'm repeating myself, what's Matthew up to? What's Luke up to? And is that why they're really utterly different? You know, you can kind of squeeze the three wise men from Matthew into Luke and come up with a crib, but you don't get both of them, and you're amalgamating two very distinct stories.
The stories of the nativity stories of Jesus in both Matthew and Luke, and the genealogy of Jesus in both Matthew and Luke, are so different, but there are some parallels in between the two. Like, okay, they both try to have some kind of genealogy of Jesus. They both assert that Jesus was born of a virgin. So are they at all deriving their accounts maybe from an earlier source that may have a shorter infancy narrative of Jesus that both are independently expanding upon?
I can't see it honestly anyway, and most scholars don't either, and I agree with them. But let me take the 2 points. Genealogy. It was terribly important, especially in the ancient world. In asserting your genealogy, you weren't into DNA, actually. What you wanted to do was make a statement about how important I am. See my genealogy. Caesar Augustus, for example, claimed, as you know, to have descended from Aeneas, who fled burning Troy to found the Roman race in Italy, genealogy was important. Now, Matthew is insisting that Jesus is the son of David. So everything comes down to that. He's quite happy to start it with Abraham. But Luke wants to say he's the son of God. So he backs the genealogy all the way from Joseph up to Adam. And he does it, of course, by taking the people out of the Old Testament, the genealogies in the Old Testament. And he constructs his own genealogy. And anyone who wants to try and get those two genealogies into harmony has too much time on their hands and refuses to accept that what Matthew is up to with his 3 sets of 15, is trying to establish that when Jesus was born to be the Messiah, you could almost have been ready for him. You know, there was 15 to David, 15 to the Babylonian exile, and 15 to Jesus? Wow! Obviously, God is designing the whole genealogy that everyone should have been ready for Jesus. So they have a profoundly serious purpose with those genealogies, but it's not to give us, it really is not to give us something we could find out today with DNA analysis or something. That's not their interest. That's why they're so diverse. Now, your other point of the virginal conception, it's rather clear in Luke, especially because he contrasts, we might have to come back to that, he contrasts John the Baptist, born of aged and infertile parents. That's the classic Jewish conception of an extraordinary child, of a destined child, of a child predestined for greatness, should be born, as it were, retrojected to be sure, of aged and infertile parents. Now, you know, that's quite a miracle. Aged and infertile parents can be verified if you have hospital records, as it were. On the other hand, in the Roman system of a predestined child, what do you have? You have a god or a goddess having intercourse with a human, male or female, and producing this divine and human child. Now, those are the two ways a predestined child is born in their world. The Jewish way with aged and infertile parents, the Greco-Roman way with a god or a goddess intervening with a human being. Now, if I want to say, as a first century follower of Jesus, as far as I'm concerned, my Jesus is more important than anyone in his own Jewish world or in the whole surrounding Greco-Roman world, I'm going to get him conceived how? Of a virginal conception. Wow! That beats even Caesar Augustus, who was born of Apollo, the god Apollo, and his mother Atia, but he had an older sister. So I'm going to claim, and this is my claim, and for this people are willing to live and die, Jesus is more important than anyone in the rest of his Judaism or the whole Greco-Roman world. Now that is a claim, and that is what you have to respond to by saying, I think these people are nuts, or else, yes, I think they might have been right. But if you do that, discussing how should I put it, the biology of Mary is a great big distraction. It's a great big way of not listening to what Matthew and Luke, they agree on this, by the way, when the few things they do agree on, they agree on the virginal conception of Jesus, not virginal birth, virginal conception of Jesus. And that's a claim. The same way as if you or I today were to say that somebody is the greatest person that ever lived. That would be a claim. And if we wanted to do it in biblical rhetoric, we might say, came from heaven, or fell from heaven, or came from another planet even, or somehow was born totally different from normalcy.
Well, the reason why I asked that question is because so on top of those other things that they have in common is that it's that they both seem to place the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem. So what I was asking is like, okay, if they either knew a common source or maybe they were inspired from a common oral tradition.
All right. I would say the two major issues that Matthew and Luke agree on in these, what I call parabolic overtures, are, we mentioned one of them, the virginal conception of Jesus. We usually say the virginal birth, but that's something completely different. Virginal conception of Jesus and the Bethlehem birth of Jesus. They both agree on that. Now, again, I don't think what they're dealing with is a common source. I think there is a common tradition, but it's not a, how would I put it, a location tradition. It's a, how would I put it? What they want to say is Jesus is the new David. David was, as everyone knows, born in Bethlehem. So if I want to say, coded as it were, dramatically, powerfully, that Jesus is the new David, then I'm going to get him born in Bethlehem, however I get him there. Born in Bethlehem. We leave conception aside. So each of them agree on this, born in Bethlehem. Now, for a moment, I don't think it's a common tradition in the sense John doesn't know it. Mark doesn't seem, Paul never heard of it. It's, how would I put it? It's a common application of identity. He is the new David. Now, again, let me focus on distraction. We could argue if we want to. Do you think maybe he really was born in Bethlehem? In any case, it's kind of a coincidence. Not every boy born in Bethlehem is a new David, but yeah, if you're going to be a new David, it helps to be born in Bethlehem. I think these are great big red herrings because here's what's been claimed. My colleague John Collins once wrote that if you ask ordinary people in the first century, what do you expect of this Messiah guy who's coming? The general consensus, and I think he's absolutely right, was that he's going to be an heroic David who would free us from the Romans. Now, how he did that, by what military strategy he would do it, or would he simply do it by divine power? It was quite clear that David was to be a military leader, even if he was suffused with transcendental power and the word of his mouth destroyed the Romans. Along comes these supporters of Jesus who claim he is the Davidic Messiah. Where's his battle plan? Where's his strategy? The Romans are still around. How can he be the Davidic Messiah? So by claiming that Jesus was the Davidic Messiah, especially after being crucified on a Roman cross, they have taken that expectation upside down. How can Jesus, crucified on a Roman cross, be the Davidic Messiah? That's not what we expected. But then if he is the Davidic Messiah, we have changed the meaning of Messiah completely. He's no longer a military leader. What type of a leader is he? And how does he save his people? And what does he save them from? So all of this creates profound visions, I think. And in a way, we're obstructing them by simply asking, well, do you think there was like an idea that maybe he was born in Bethlehem or they didn't know where, so they just chose Bethlehem? What the heck is as good a place as any? I think what I'm pleading for is understand the purpose of Matthew and Luke. Then you can disagree with it or agree with it, but at least you have to understand it and accept it first.
So where did they get the idea from that Jesus was born in Christmas time?
Oh, that's us. That's us. And I don't even bother most of the time working out the history of it. But I can say one thing. As you know, I lived in Jerusalem. I lived in Jerusalem. I was then in Jordan from 65 to 67. And I was down in Bethlehem 2 years in a row. That would be in 65 and 66. And it was cold. I don't remember. There might have been a sprinkling of snow one year. I may be confusing it with Jerusalem, but it was cold. That's what I remember. And you were not out in the fields keeping your sheep, because no self-respecting sheep would want to be out in the field in that sort of cold. So whatever time we're imagining and supposed to imagine in Luke's story, the shepherds were in the fields. In the fields. It wasn't December. Unless you're going to say climate change has reversed itself and it was nice and hot in Bethlehem in December. And all I could say, 2 years when I was there, it wasn't. We invented it. I think, it's a midterm. It's bringing light out of darkness. It's bringing joy out of gloom. I think it's a much better time to have this celebration, to be honest with you, than the middle of July. Maybe I'm prejudiced because I'm in Florida and it's a bit too hot, but it's the perfect time to do it. It's the middle of winter, middle of cold, the middle of dark. Remember, I grew up in Ireland. In the winter, it used to be dark by 3:30 to 4 in the winter, very early. So what better time to bring light into darkness and joy into cold than what we chose? But it's a random association.
Did they perhaps get the idea from cultures from prior to them that because I know the Christmas thing is obviously a late development, and early Christians did not follow that. But did they get the idea from others that may have had festivals in December, and that's why they later assigned the birth of Jesus to the month of December?
Yeah, I think, Jacob, almost certainly, because as as Christianity developed, it was really great at plunking a church over a pagan temple until the mosque came along and plunked it over a church, of course, and taking a pagan festival, let us say a midwinter festival, and plunking the Christian festival on top of it, and therefore kind of wiping it out, as it were. Yes. So almost you could feel certain that it would maybe a midwinter festival was being wiped out by putting the birth of Jesus at Christmas. Yes.
What is significant about Josephus talking about the character referred to as Amaram in relation to Jesus?
Let me focus on Matthew then. We touched on this just in passing. Let me try and imagine, if you will. Let me play Matthew. And I've written my gospel now. I've started in what we call, let me do it this way, what we call chapter 3. I brought in Jesus as the new Moses. The first thing I do is plunk him up on a new Mount Sinai. We call it the Sermon on the Mount, which is an atrocious name. It's the new Moses on the new Mount Sinai, giving, as he says, a new law. And by new, he does not mean something which replaces the old, but which consummates the old, brings it to completion, brings it to perfection. That's what Matthew understands. Now, he's got that written. How do I start my story? I'm going to be writing this on papyrus, wall-to-wall capital Greek letters. Wouldn't it be nice if up front I could put a sort of a little overture? Like we might have a prologue today, and with a prologue written up and would tell us sort of what we're going to do. And there might be all sorts of headings to help us. But he's going to have a wall-to-wall writing in a papyrus. So some kind of an introduction, some kind of a prologue, a prelude, an overture. What I have to do, thinks Matthew, I have to write the birth of Jesus like the birth of a new Moses. And of course, after that, he'll have nothing to say until he gets Jesus pretty much baptized and into his public life, because he has no data. He has no data beyond the fact that Jesus was born of Mary and Joseph, and he wants him born in Bethlehem, and he wants him born of a virginal conception, but he has no data. But he has this brilliant, maybe obvious, if Jesus is the new Moses on the new Mount Sinai, then he should be born as the new baby Moses who almost gets killed by the new Pharaoh. So Matthew, I have to tell the story of Jesus as the new Moses. Now, go into Exodus. Go into the story of Exodus. It's pretty sparse. Okay. Pharaoh attempts to kill let me back up a bit. The Jewish people, according to Exodus, are in the northeast corner of Egypt. They're dangerous from the point of view of the Pharaoh, because that's where any invasion would come, and they might go over to the invaders. So he decides to exterminate the Jewish people. And he tries it in a way that doesn't work, because the Jewish midwives won't cooperate. So he decides to kill all the boys. That he thinks will exterminate the race. And then, according to the story, Amram and Jochebed, the parents to be of Moses, they still go ahead and have a child. Why would they do that and risk having this? If it were a boy, they risk having this child killed. And besides, isn't it weird that God's plan has Moses born in the middle of a pogrom? That's pretty bad timing. So what we call Midrashim, plural of Midrash, a Midrash, something that was done by preachers, let us say, in the first century, was to retell the Jewish stories. We're talking about storytelling Midrashim, let's say, and they would answer the two questions I just asked, for example. Inquiring minds might say to a preacher, okay, you've just told us this Exodus story, that's lovely, but why on earth did God let Moses be born in the middle of a pogrom? What kind of timing is that? And besides, why did Amram and Jochebed, his parents, go ahead and have kids in the middle of a pogrom? So the Midrashim, you find them, for example, in Josephus, because when he retells the biblical story, he feeds into it these current popular stories in use in the synagogue, and they enlarge the story, in not only in Josephus, but in other ones from the same time. Here's the way they tell the story, and the answering those two objections, as it were. Pharaoh has a dream. In this dream, he sees a scale, a balance. And in this balance, on one side is a lamb, a small lamb, and on the other is Egypt. And the lamb outweighs Egypt completely. The balance goes right down for Egypt. So Pharaoh, now try and hear echoes from Matthew as I'm speaking. Pharaoh has a dream, and he calls in his wise people, his seers, his advisors, and he asks them, explain the dream. And they say, there's going to be a child born to the Egyptians, born to the Israelites who will destroy Egypt. So, of course, immediately, in good old fashioned procedure, Pharaoh decides to kill all the newborn boys. So that's what happened. It wasn't just that Moses happened to get born in the middle of a pogrom. The pogrom was to get Moses. Oh, so it was to get Moses that the slaughter was decreed. You hear the echoes? It was to get Jesus, of course, that Herod did it. Second question. But why would his parents go ahead and have a child at all? Wouldn't it be better not to? And that's where, again, we get another midrash, and it's in various ways. For example, in one version, the parents, Amram and Jochebed, refuse to not have children. They say, we will have children. We will trust God. And then because of that, God decrees your child will be the predestined one. Or Miriam, the older sister of Moses to be, is a prophetess, and she tells him, go ahead and have a child because the boy will be the predestined one. So when Matthew is packaging, as it were, his Jesus as his baby Jesus as the new baby Moses, he's got more data than the bare bones story in Exodus. So, for example, he can bring in the Magi. And here's what anyone should get it. And if your 7-year-old doesn't ask you this, he or she isn't thinking. The Magi are Iranian. They're Gentiles, obviously, that's the point. They're Gentiles coming from Iran. They're wise. They're not kings, by the way. They're not kings. The kings ain't the hero of this story. The King Herod is the problem. And I kind of like it. They're scholars, so I like scholars being there. So they come from Iran. They're following this magic star, which, like Venus, taking Aeneas all the way from Troy to Rome, it's taking them westward from Iran's, as it were, to Israel. But now, if the star guides them, why do they have to stop off at Jerusalem and ask for directions? When we all know that men never ask for directions, that's why they're lost all the time. But now we have these Magi following their star, no problem, all the way to Jerusalem. Where's the star? Why do they have to stop off at Jerusalem and ask for directions? That is the giveaway to the author's intention. Because if they don't stop in Jerusalem and ask for directions, then Herod's not in the story. There's no slaughter of the innocent. There's no flight into Egypt. And the whole story falls flat in its face. So the star takes them to Jerusalem. They ask the question that causes the whole slaughter of the innocent. And then the star picks up again and directs them right to the house. It's a very specific magic star. Of course, every bit as magical as the star that took Aeneas westward all the way to Italy. So if you understand what's going on, everything falls into place. The story, anyone in the first century reading the story of Matthew would be, it would be like neon signs, new Moses, new Moses, new Moses. But the terrible tragedy, let me back off. The political manifesto is that Israel, under Herod, who is the Rome-appointed king of the Jews, if Herod is king of the Jews, it's time to go from Israel into Egypt. Now, we don't get it maybe, but at least you're supposed to flee, as Moses did, from Egypt into Israel. Egypt should be the place of bondage, of fear, of terror, Israel the place of safety. Now, once Rome has appointed Herod king of the Jews, it's time to leave. That's a powerful, powerful political statement, religio-political, if you will, but it's definitely a political statement.
How does the genealogies that were given in Matthew and Luke provide a sense of destiny?
Well, let me start with Matthew first, because as we said, they're quite different. Matthew has 3 14s, right? 14 generations. And sometimes it's they're all male, by the way. They're all males generating males, which must have been a different way of doing things. Male generating males. But what? There's 14, make certain I get it right now. There's 14 from Abraham to David, right? Then there's 14 from David to the Babylonian exile. And anyone now who is reading at that point must know there has to be a third set of 14 generations, because ancient stories tend to go in threes. The priest, the Levite, the Samaritan in Jesus's parable. Very often, the third one is it. So if you're reading this, then something has to happen after another 14 generations. David, wow. Babylonian exile and return. 14. What is it? What is it? Jesus the Messiah, of course. What else? So, like all of human history, falls into a plan which makes it sort of genealogically inevitable that Jesus is the Messiah. That's a powerful use of genealogy. It's fictional, of course, and it's the way Matthew does it. Now, along comes Luke. Luke is not primarily interested in Jesus as the Messiah or the new David or the new Moses, for that matter. He wants him the Son of God, like Adam was the Son of God. So instead of descending down to Jesus, he ascends up to Adam. And Adam is the Son of God, Jesus is the Son of God. And of course, in both cases, Son of God means heir of God. I think it would be fair in the New Testament that every time you find the word Son of God, you crossed out son, which we kind of think biologically, and put in heir, G-I-R, H-E-I-R, that is, heir of God. Again, it's a claim. So the genealogies structured the destiny of this child. And, a predestined child without genealogical warnings, that's not a good story. I mean, you don't really want to tell the story of Alexander the Great and simply say he was conceived. You want something dramatic. No person of great importance comes into this world, the ancient world, quietly.
So I want to go back to what you were saying earlier. So rather than, as you stated earlier, rather than suggesting that Matthew and Luke depended on a common text or even a common tradition, you think that what's probably going on is that Matthew and Luke are feeling the pressure to look into Jesus' past. They want to create information about Jesus' origins, that in which Mark doesn't get into, because either Matthew and Luke themselves or their respective communities want to know more about Jesus than texts like Mark provide them. So they're both going through the Old Testament. They're looking at King David because they're supposed to be believing that Jesus descended from David. And as you said earlier, that Matthew is trying to make Jesus look more like Moses. So in that case, what's Luke trying to make Jesus more of instead?
Okay. And by the way, let me just be clear. I think they do have a common tradition about Jesus being born in Bethlehem and a common tradition about the virginal conception. I don't think it's a text as a word that they're
Okay.
talking about, but I think Jesus was certainly proclaimed as the Davidic Messiah. And therefore, I think even before them, somebody had said, well, that must mean he was born in Bethlehem, which of course could be or could not be. But so common tradition, yes. We're touching now on something which maybe is of more importance than anything. A huge, huge difference between the birth story in Matthew. Let me back off a little bit. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John each begins with an introduction. Let me use a word like that: an introduction, a prelude, a prologue, a getting the story going by a sort of a little overture. By an overture, I mean a way of telling you something which gets you ready for what follows. Like you might have it if you've ever seen a Gilbert Sullivan operetta, when I was at high school, we did one every year for Christmas, so I kind of know at least 5 of them. And the music at the beginning that's orchestral before the story begins is sort of an overture of all the music you're going to hear. It gets you ready. So, for example, Mark gets you ready with John the Baptist, whose fate, F-A-T-E, is going to be a model for what happens to Jesus. They're both going to get killed. John, of course, has a magnificent hymn that Jesus is the Logos made flesh. That's an overture too, John 1:1-18. Only Matthew and Luke use as an overture a birth narrative. They both do it. But this, apart from the differences that we talked about, and apart from the similarities we talked about, virginal birth and Bethlehem, virginal conception and Bethlehem birth, here's the stunning difference. And it's crucial. It's the whole history of Christianity in a nutshell, honestly. As far as Matthew is concerned, as we've just seen, Jesus is in continuity. Let's say the Old Testament, the New Testament is in continuity with the Old Testament. Jesus is in continuity with Moses. He is the new Moses, and that might be dangerous for us to say because we tend to think, especially in this modern age, coming out of Silicon Valley, that it's the new thing, and the old is the fuddy-duddy, discarded, whatever. New in the first century meant renewed. If you were doing something like Augustus, in declaring he was in charge, said he was renewing the republic. Just renewing the republic. He didn't say this is a whole new thing that I'm running the world like a dictator, whether you like it or not. No. Or a king, an anything but name. He seems to, I'm renewing. So what he's doing is a renewed. New in the sense of renewed, brought to perfection, consummated, whatever. That's the vision of Matthew. What Jesus did was not dismiss the law and the prophets, as he says, but bring them to their consummation and perfection. Now, some other Jews would say, we don't agree with that. Fine. But Matthew is not saying, well, that old stuff is finished. Here comes Jesus, new stuff. No. In fact, in that world, that was tricky to announce that you were new because, the old had worked. So be careful saying it's new. Renewed, yes. So for Matthew, let me enlarge it, what we call Christianity, and that's a later term, a much later term, is in continuity with Judaism. Now, there may be radical dislocations, and it's not everyone was agreeing with Matthew. I think his fellow Pharisees probably didn't. But they're celebrating continuity. Turn now to Luke 1 and 2. He's doing the opposite. There's John the Baptist, who represents the Old Testament. Look how he's born. He's born of aged and infertile parents. That's how Isaac, for example, or somebody in the Old Testament gets born. If you're a predestined child in the Old Testament, then watch out for aged and infertile parents conceiving a child. even if Sarah laughs at the whole idea. That's discontinuity. Read Luke 1 and 2, and if you can do this, separate out the whole story of John the Baptist from his announcement of his birth to the time he's kept in the desert, and the story of Jesus. Watch the parallels and watch consistently that everything about Jesus is bigger, better, and sort of a replacement for that of John. So if I were to summarize it, I would say Matthew celebrates continuity. Luke celebrates discontinuity or precedence, or any term you want to use. That's the most profound difference. That you're getting ready when you read Luke and 2 to understand that the law and the prophets were up to John, but after that, something radically new has arrived. And that's, of course, that's the history of Christianity and Judaism. Does Christianity recognize across 2,000 years and down through 2,000 years its absolute indebtedness to Judaism? Or does it think it's some kind of a brand new thing that could exist, or that Jesus could have existed, as if everyone who listened to him didn't know what the kingdom of God is and everything else he's talking about in terms of its biblical origins? So it's a question of continuity or discontinuity. And that for me is the most profound difference between Matthew 1 and 2 and Luke 1 and 2.
So, if you do have an opinion on this, about where you think Jesus may have most likely have been born, do you think that maybe Nazareth, as some think that Mark, since Mark calls him Jesus of Nazareth, that maybe he's from Nazareth? Or do you think it could be historically the case that he really was born in Bethlehem?
No, it would be something that I would never want to bother arguing about. But I take it for granted that Jesus was born in the normal way of Mary and Joseph in Nazareth. Now, look, I told you 2 years when I was living it was then in Jordan, of course. When I was living there, it never occurred to me for Christmas, which I could have done, to go over into Israel and go up to Nazareth. Of course not. I knew, let me put it bluntly, that Jesus was born there. But for almost 2,000 years, Bethlehem has been celebrated as his birthday. So of course I went to Bethlehem. I went there to walk in the footsteps of 2,000 years of people who had done it. This is where the birth is celebrated. That's a different question. That's a liturgical question, as it were. That's a celebratory question. That's where do you celebrate it? Now, you want to get into history? Where did it happen? That's a separate issue. I think that was Nazareth. And by the way, in the ancient world, they have to have it both ways. They want Jesus descended kind of biologically from Joseph, because Joseph is of the house of David. So apart from Bethlehem completely, we want him descended from David. But that means he was born of David, of Joseph. Well, how could he be son of God and son of Joseph? Look, nobody in the ancient world would have had a problem with that. I would have said, well, wait a minute now, if there's a virginal conception, don't you understand how a parable works, they would have said. We're making a claim about Jesus, and yes, we can make a claim he was born of Joseph. That makes him Davidic. He was born of a virginal conception. That makes him extraordinary. And we won't have any problem putting those together, because nobody would have had any problem saying, well, wait a minute now, was Augustus really born of Apollo? Does that mean that his father wasn't his father? That Octavius was not his father? That somehow we're dealing with with some form of transcendental adultery? Nobody thought like that in the ancient world. I doubt if people would have, as it were, mocked Octavius if he was still alive, because Augustus had been conceived, according to the story, probably going back to about 30 BCE, that he had been conceived by Apollo, the god. We don't live in a world anymore. I was going to say, we don't live in a world anymore that understands metaphor and parable. But then I'm thinking, why are most people loving Star Wars or Lord of the Rings? Yeah, we want our own parables, our own, as it were, metaphors, but we can't recognize the ancient ones. We think everyone in the first century was a literalist, if not a fundamentalist. And that only happens because we haven't read enough first century texts. If you've only read Matthew and Luke, then it's quite possible to think, well, this must be factual. That nobody says this is a parable, so we're getting facts. If you happen to have read everything else that was available in the first century and try to imagine what people would have been hearing, then you'd have said, wait a minute, they had no problem with making up the Midrashim, the fictions. Midrashim is just a fancy word for fiction, for fictionalizing expansions of the biblical texts. Nobody was amazed by that. And if I listened to one Midrashic scholar over here who told the story this way, and another Midrashic scholar here who told it differently, it didn't bother me. I kind of put them together in my mind or chose one. So if we can't understand metaphor and parable, I'm not even using myth for the moment, I would say get out of the Bible, go read something else, because it'd be impossible to understand these people.
You know, you brought up an interesting point a moment ago about Emperor Augustus and how he was viewed as being the son of a deity. And I wanted to ask, what was I? Okay, here we go. I got it. How did they view Jesus as the son of David when Joseph technically isn't his father, not biologically?
Yeah.
And Mary, well, there's no indication that she is supposedly a descendant of David. Now, some claim that Luke's genealogy is a genealogy of Mary, but that doesn't work because it specifies it's really Joseph's genealogy, which conflicts with Matthew's version of that genealogy of Joseph. So, in your view, how did they make that work in light of those issues?
First of all, we have to stress they did. I think you're quite right. If you want Jesus to be the new Davidic Messiah, you can do it by having him born in Bethlehem, and it even helps, as you just said, to have him born of a father who's reputed to have descended from David. But then, of course, are you saying that Joseph just selected him, or that Joseph adopted him? I'm sure if we got into this, we could say, well, wait a minute now, Augustus, let's go back and give him his old name.
It looks like we lost John Dominic Crossan. Given that his video froze, I'm not surprised he ended up getting disconnected. We'll have to wait and see if he can come back in here. If not, that might be it. Apologies, everyone. I'm going to need a second to figure out what's going on. I'm going to wait a couple of more minutes to see if he rejoins. If not, I'm going to go ahead and end the stream, and I'll trim this end of it out after. Oh, here he is. He's back.
Sorry, I think we got disconnected.
Yeah, I saw that. It's all good.
All right. Now, I don't know what we would have lost in transit. You had asked the question about how could Jesus be born of a virginal conception and still be the son of David?
Yeah, that was my question. Yeah.
As far as I can understand the ancient world, to say that somebody was, let me use a concrete example. Octavian, who became Caesar the Augustus, as we know, the story was that, and this story probably goes back to the time of the Battle of Actium and the invasion of Egypt afterwards, so maybe 30 BCE. The story is that Atia, his mother, had gone into the temple of Apollo and been impregnated by Apollo, so that he was actually the son of a god, Deus in Latin, Theos in Greek. Now, he was also, of course, the adopted son of his great uncle, Julius Caesar, who was a divus, that is, a human being who'd been elevated to divine status. Rome had two different words, a deus for a god, an immortal god, and then a divus for somebody who'd been brought up from humanity to divinity, as it were. But by the way, Greek had no such distinction. If you were the son of a divus or a deus in Latin, you were a theou weos in Greek, the same thing that Mark says of Jesus. So this is a title. Now, again, I repeat, every title is a claim. So when you call Jesus Theophilus, you're making a claim about him. If you call him Son of David, you're making a different claim about him. Well, if you said to somebody in the first century, how can Jesus be conceived virginally and born of David, born of Joseph? I think they would have told you, get a life. I think they would have said, have you never been in a parable before? But I don't want to make that sound flippant, because parables are claims, and people live by claims and die for claims. So if somebody says Jesus is the Davidic Messiah, then they immediately have to make a decision. But the Davidic Messiah was supposed to be a warrior leader. Is Jesus calling us to violent rebellion against Rome? Or could he be turning David on his head and asking for non-violent resistance to Rome? That's sort of what's at issue here. And again, if you have another claim, virginal conception, you're making a claim that Jesus is more important than any other child born in the Greco-Roman or his own Jewish world. That's a claim. And if you're, as it were, talking in the public square, somebody will say, how can you make a claim like that? Moses or David were supposed to be our savior. How's Jesus saving us? That's where you get a first century answer. He's not saving us by the sword. Maybe he's saving us from the sword. So anytime somebody makes these titles, you unpack the claim that's in the title, and then you can make your judgment. Will you live or die by that claim, or do you just think it's simply wrong?
And in my closing question, do you think that the earliest Christians that followed Jesus, do you think that they believed literally that he was the Son of God, or do you think it was originally meant to be a parable?
It was originally meant to be a parable. I think everyone in the first century understood parables, and we have forgotten how to do it. That is why, I'm going back to where I started. Luke, at the end of Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan, what does he say? Go and do likewise. Now, what does that mean? Dress up like a Samaritan, go up and down the Jerusalem road till you find somebody in the ditch, get him on a donkey, and pay for his inn. Of course not. So you have to think, how do I do that? How do I go and do likewise? That's the function of a parable, to make you think. So to say, for example, that Jesus is the Son of God in a world in which Caesar is already Son of God is, first of all, high treason, to mention that in passing. And if you decide to live by it, you have to ask yourself, well, if Caesar is the Son of God and the Savior of the world, how do we need a second one? There must be a different type of saving the world. You have two competing Son of Gods. That's what we've lost. So if Caesar, I'm going to put it this way, if you take Caesar as Son of God literally, then take Jesus as Son of God literally. You still have high treason. If you take Caesar metaphorically, Jesus metaphorically, just don't cheat and say Caesar was just a metaphor, but Jesus is literal. No, you take them both on the same register, and no matter how you do it, be very careful, because you've just committed high treason. And you better be serious.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Dom.
Always a pleasure, Jacob. So anytime. And thank you very, very much. And happy Christmas. Happy holy days. In case we don't
Happy Christmas to you too.
All right.
And to everyone else watching right now.
Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.